The door opened without warning, and everything Marcus thought he knew about his life shattered in that single moment. He wasn't supposed to be home at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, not when board meetings and investor calls owned every minute of his existence. But the Singapore deal had collapsed faster than expected, and his private jet had landed 2 hours early. The mansion should have been silent, predictable, empty except for the housekeeper moving quietly through rooms that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. But as he stepped through the side entrance, the one he used when schedules broke and plans fell apart, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A voice drifted down the hallway, calm and steady, counting numbers that were too complex for a child, too advanced for casual conversation. "Start again," the voice said, gentle but firm, like a teacher who had done this 1,000 times before. "Slow this time. Don't rush your thinking. Let the ideas settle." Marcus froze, his hand still on the door, his jacket smelling of jet fuel and expensive cologne. That wasn't the voice of the tutor he paid $300 an hour. That wasn't his ex-wife's voice or his assistant's voice. That was Nyla, the maid, the woman who cleaned his floors and organized his closets and smiled politely when he walked past without really seeing her. He moved forward, one careful step at a time, until he stood just outside the study where light spilled across the marble floor like an accusation. Through the narrow crack in the door, he saw his son sitting at the massive oak desk, sleeves rolled up, face tight with concentration, chalk dust covering his small fingers like evidence of something secret and forbidden. The chalkboard behind them wasn't filled with simple addition or spelling words. It was covered in equations, symbols, fractions layered on top of each other like steps climbing toward something he couldn't quite understand. And there, standing beside his 10-year-old son with her uniform sleeves folded back and her posture radiating quiet confidence, was Nyla. She held a piece of chalk in her hand, moving it across the board with the precision of someone who had taught in universities, not someone who scrubbed toilets and folded laundry. "This isn't about being fast," she said softly, erasing a mistake and rewriting it with gentle authority. "It's about seeing the truth hiding underneath the numbers." His son nodded, eyes bright with understanding, not confusion, not frustration, but pure joy. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, not loudly, not all at once, but enough to change everything that would come next. He had built empires, moved markets, commanded rooms full of powerful men who feared his decisions, yet standing in the shadows of his own home. Watching his housekeeper teach his son mathematics that made his head spin, he felt small, ignorant, and impossibly late. Before we continue this story, tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. Someone near you might be watching too. And don't forget to subscribe to support and appreciate the work we do on this channel. The chalk snapped in half, and the sound exploded through the room like a gunshot, sharp and final and impossible to ignore. Nyla froze mid-sentence, her hand suspended in the air, and Marcus watched as his son turned slowly, his face draining of color when he saw his father standing in the doorway. Marcus wasn't angry, not yet, but his presence filled the space like a storm cloud, heavy and unpredictable, and suddenly the joy that had been dancing in his son's eyes vanished, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to fear. No one spoke, and the silence stretched between them like a rope pulled too tight, ready to snap at any moment. Marcus had faced hostile takeovers, courtroom battles, and rooms full of investors waiting for him to fail, but none of that had prepared him for this quiet confrontation inside his own home, where the air felt thick with unspoken accusations, and his heart pounded against his ribs like it was trying to escape. "What is this?" he finally asked, and his voice came out more controlled than he felt. But there was something underneath it, something raw and vulnerable that he hadn't meant to reveal. His son stood up quickly, knocking his chair back, and started to speak, his words tumbling out in a rush of panic. "Dad, I was just—" But Nyla raised her hand gently, stopping him with a gesture so calm and authoritative that Marcus felt a flash of something he didn't want to name. She didn't step back or lower her eyes or apologize the way people usually did when he caught them doing something they shouldn't. She simply turned, wiped the chalk dust on a cloth with deliberate care, and met his gaze without flinching. He was learning, she said, and those 3 words landed harder than any insult or accusation ever could. Learning. The word echoed in his mind, mocking him, challenging him, forcing him to see what he had been avoiding for months, maybe years. Marcus looked at the chalkboard again, really looked this time, and recognized enough to know this wasn't some trick or game. This was real understanding, deep and structured, the kind of thinking he paid specialists 6 figures to handle for his companies. "How long?" he asked, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. Nyla hesitated for just a moment, and in that pause, Marcus saw something flicker across her face. Calculation, maybe a caution. "Long enough to know he's gifted," she said finally, "and long enough to know he was bored." That word hit him like a punch to the gut. Bored. His son shifted uncomfortably, his small hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I like it, Dad," he said, and there was a pleading quality to his voice that made Marcus want to look away. "She explains it in a way that actually makes sense." Marcus swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. He had hired the best tutors, enrolled his son in the most expensive schools, bought every educational program that promised results. Yet here stood the maid, unlocking something no one else had noticed, or maybe no one else had cared enough to see. If you're still watching, drop a comment and tell me. Have you ever realized too late that you missed what mattered most? The glass shattered against the wall, not loudly or dramatically, but with just enough force to spill water across the hardwood floor and make Marcus stop pacing like a caged animal in his own study. He stood alone in the room where he had signed billion-dollar deals with steadier hands than the ones trembling at his sides right now, and outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights blinked like 1,000 silent witnesses to his unraveling. He couldn't stop seeing the chalkboard, couldn't stop replaying the way Nyla's hand had moved across it with such certainty, couldn't stop hearing his son's voice saying, "She explains it in a way that actually makes sense." And each memory felt like another crack in the foundation of everything he thought he had built. He sat down heavily in the leather chair that cost more than most people's cars, rubbing his face with both hands. And for the first time in years, the numbers that had always made perfect sense to him suddenly refused to line up. They pointed somewhere he didn't want to look, backward toward all the missed dinners and unread school emails and mornings when he had kissed his son's head without actually asking how he was doing or what he was thinking or whether anyone was really listening to him. Marcus had told himself a story for so long, a comfortable story about being a good father because he provided the best schools and the safest neighborhoods and the most expensive opportunities, and that story had worked perfectly until tonight when it collapsed under the weight of 3 simple words. He was bored. He opened his laptop, pulled up his son's academic reports with hands that still hadn't stopped shaking, and started reading the comments he had skimmed past before, the polite observations from teachers that suddenly felt like quiet accusations. Polite but disengaged, bright but distracted, seems capable of more. Capable of more. Marcus closed the laptop slowly, the words echoing in his head like a verdict he couldn't appeal, and across the hall he heard a door creak open, followed by soft footsteps that made him move without thinking. He stopped halfway down the corridor, staying hidden in the shadows the way he had learned to do in boardrooms when he wanted to observe without being seen, and watched as Nyla stepped out of the study carrying the chalkboard eraser in one hand and a cloth folded neatly over her arm. She paused, standing perfectly still as if she could feel the weight of the house watching her, and then she turned back and looked at the board one last time before switching off the light. Her face held no triumph, no fear, no satisfaction at having been caught, doing something she wasn't supposed to do, just quiet responsibility, the kind that disturbed Marcus more than defiance ever could. The next morning, he sat at the breakfast table earlier than usual, and when his son walked in with sleepy eyes and uncertain steps, Marcus felt something twist painfully in his chest. "Sit," he said, and his voice came out gentler than he expected. The boy hesitated, his small frame tensing. "Am I in trouble?" That question landed harder than any accusation, harder than any insult, and Marcus realized with sudden clarity that his son had learned to expect punishment instead of conversation. "You've watched this far, which means you understand something most people miss. that the real stories worth hearing are the ones that challenge what we think we know about success and sacrifice. But here's what non-subscribers don't realize. This channel tells dozens of stories like this, each one revealing truths about power, family, and the choices that define us. And if you're not subscribed, you're gambling that you'll accidentally find the next one instead of having it waiting for you. Don't leave your next revelation to chance. Subscribe now, so you never miss the moment that changes how you see everything. The argument exploded behind a closed door, not with raised voices because those were easy to control, but with sharp words spoken carefully, each one wrapped in silk but cutting like a blade. Marcus stood in his private office with his phone pressed against his ear, so hard it hurt, staring at a spreadsheet he couldn't read anymore because the numbers had stopped making sense the moment he realized he had been counting the wrong things his entire life. On the other end of the line, his executive assistant was listing his schedule for the week in that efficient tone he usually appreciated, every hour already claimed by meetings and calls and obligations that suddenly felt like chains. "I'll be home early tomorrow," Marcus said suddenly, and the words surprised him as much as they surprised her. There was a pause, the kind that stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. "Sir, you have the board dinner tomorrow night. Cancel it," he said, and his voice didn't waver even though his hands did. Another pause, longer this time, heavy with unspoken questions. "That hasn't happened in 8 years, sir." "It's happening now," Marcus replied, and he ended the call before doubt could crawl back in and convince him to change his mind. That afternoon, he found himself walking down the hallway again without meaning to, his feet carrying him to the same spot where he had stood the day before. And once again he stayed hidden in the shadows, watching through the crack in the door. Inside the study, Nyla wasn't teaching numbers this time. She was telling a story, sitting across from his son with her hands folded on the desk, speaking in that calm voice that made everything sound important. "People think being smart means never failing," she said, and Marcus leaned closer without realizing it. "That's wrong. Smart people fail faster because they try harder." His son frowned, his young face scrunching up in confusion. "But failing feels bad." "Yes," Nyla replied gently, and there was something in her voice that made Marcus's chest tighten. "That's how you know it matters." The words hit him like a physical blow, and he pressed his hand against the doorframe to steady himself. No tutor had ever spoken to his son like this, with this kind of honesty, this kind of respect for the difficulty of learning and growing. Suddenly, his son asked a question that made the air in the hallway feel too thin. "Why don't you teach at my school?" Nyla smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes, and Marcus saw something flicker across her face that looked like old pain, carefully managed. "Some doors don't open for everyone," she said quietly, and in that moment, Marcus understood that there was a story here he didn't know, a history he had never bothered to ask about. That night at dinner, he did something reckless, something that made the housekeeper's eyes widen and his son's face light up with confused joy. He invited Nyla to sit at the table with them. "Have you ever broken your own rules because you finally realized they were keeping out the wrong people?" The boy slammed his book shut, not in anger, but in courage, and the sound echoed through the dining room like a declaration of war. "I want Nyla to teach me every day," he said, and the sentence dropped into the space between them like a glass falling from a table, waiting to shatter. Marcus looked up slowly from his plate, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, unsure if he had heard correctly, and across the room, Nyla stood frozen near the doorway with her hands tightening around the serving tray until her knuckles turned white. "That's not how things work," Marcus replied, and he chose his words the way he always did in boardrooms, carefully and defensively, trying to maintain control of a situation that was already slipping through his fingers. His son didn't back down, and there was something new in his eyes, something Marcus had never seen before. Determination mixed with desperation. "Why not?" the boy asked, and his voice didn't shake the way Marcus expected it to. "She makes me understand things. The others just tell me what to memorize and then move on before I can even think about it." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences that had filled this house over the years, and Marcus could feel the difference in his bones. This wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. This was dangerous, The kind of moment where everything could change depending on what happened next. Nyla spoke first, her voice soft but firm, and Marcus hated how grateful he felt for her intervention. "That's not my place," she said, addressing the boy, but watching Marcus from the corner of her eye. "You have tutors, trained professionals who know how to do this properly." Marcus nodded too quickly, relieved by her retreat, eager to grab onto any excuse that would restore the normal order of things. "Exactly. We already have a system in place, son, and it's working fine." His son stood up then, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made Marcus wince. And when the boy spoke again, his voice cracked with emotion. "Your system makes me feel stupid." That word hung in the air like poison, and Marcus felt it sink into his chest and settle there, heavy and accusing. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his own voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "That's not fair, and you know it." "It's true," the boy said, and there were tears building in his eyes now, tears that Marcus realized he had caused by not seeing, not listening, not being there when it mattered. "They rush me through everything. They don't listen when I ask questions." "Nyla listens." Marcus turned toward her, frustration and something uglier rising in his throat. "You shouldn't encourage this kind of behavior." She met his gaze without flinching, and in that moment Marcus saw something in her eyes that terrified him. Absolute certainty. "I didn't encourage anything," she said calmly. He spoke for himself, and maybe that's what frightens you most. The house was quiet that night, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the dangerous kind, the kind that hums with unspoken tension and secrets waiting to explode. Marcus moved down the hallway again, drawn by something he couldn't name, something that felt like gravity pulling him toward a truth he wasn't ready to face. He stopped outside the study, where dim light spilled under the door, and through the narrow opening he could see Nyla kneeling beside his son, her uniform still perfectly pressed even at this late hour, guiding him through a problem that had made 3 different tutors throw up their hands in frustration. She didn't speak much, but every word she did say was precise and measured, and there was an intimacy to her patience that made Marcus's chest tighten with something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. He had seen brilliance before in boardrooms and universities, had hired people who could move markets and manipulate numbers with supernatural skill, but this quiet, tender shaping of a young mind was something entirely different, something he couldn't command or buy or control. Marcus noticed something then that made him step closer, his heart suddenly pounding. A framed photograph tucked behind books on the shelf, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. The photo showed a younger Nyla standing beside a chalkboard covered in equations so complex they made his head hurt just looking at them. And her eyes in that picture were serious, almost defiant, like she was daring the world to doubt her. His mind raced with questions he had never thought to ask. How many children like his son had she guided in silence over the years? How many talents had gone unnoticed because adults refused to see beyond uniforms and job titles? And why had she never mentioned any of this? The boy looked up suddenly, catching his father's shadow in the doorway, and his voice came out sharp with protective urgency. "Dad, don't come in. She'll stop if you watch." Nyla smiled faintly, and there was something sad in that smile, something that spoke of years of being observed and judged and underestimated. "Go ahead," she said to Marcus, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Let him see. It's part of the lesson." Marcus hesitated, his hand on the doorframe, every instinct screaming at him to turn away and preserve the comfortable ignorance he had lived in for so long. But he stepped forward instead, and as he watched them work together, watched his son's face light up with understanding, watched Nyla correct mistakes with gentle precision, the truth hit him harder than any business failure ever had. He had underestimated the quiet ones, the people who did the work without recognition or praise, the ones who taught without permission because they couldn't stand to see potential wasted. The night stretched long and uncomfortable, and outside the city blinked in neon oblivion, while inside Marcus realized that being present sometimes meant stepping into a lesson he had never expected to learn. By the time he left the room, his hands were trembling, not with fear, but with the terrible awareness that something profound had shifted in his understanding of everything, and he knew without question that nothing would ever be the same. Comment below. When did you realize the most important person in your life was someone you've been overlooking? The house groaned under the weight of a storm that wasn't outside, but inside Marcus's chest, pressing against his ribs like it was trying to break free. He had returned earlier than usual again, not because of business this time, but because he couldn't stay away, couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen, couldn't silence the voice in his head asking how he had missed this for so long. Every step through the hallways felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets that accused him just by existing, and his mind raced with questions that kept him awake at night. How had he failed to notice his son's hunger for understanding? And why had Nyla's presence always felt so quiet yet so impossible to ignore? He stopped outside the study again and pressed his palm against the doorframe, feeling the cool wood under his skin, and through the crack he saw his son crouched beside the chalkboard with Nyla whispering explanations so low that only the boy could hear them. Marcus watched his son's hands move along the board, correcting equations and piecing together ideas that should have been years beyond his age. But it wasn't just the mathematics that stunned him. It was the pride radiating from his son's face, the confidence that neither expensive tutors nor prestigious schools had ever managed to ignite. Nyla looked up then, and her gaze met his through the sliver of open door, calm and unwavering and fearless in a way that made Marcus feel like he was the one being examined. Her expression didn't shift or soften. She wasn't pleading for approval or asking for permission. She was simply doing what needed to be done. And in that look, Marcus realized the depth of her courage and the quiet rebellion of her intelligence. A memory stabbed him suddenly, sharp and unwelcome. A time years ago when his son had asked him a question about how airplanes stayed in the sky, and Marcus had brushed him off with a distracted, "We'll talk about it later," that had never come. Too consumed by board meetings and phone calls and deadlines that felt urgent but weren't. Not really. Guilt rose in his throat like acid, burning and bitter, because he had built wealth and power and influence, but had utterly failed to build understanding or connection or presence with the one person who should have mattered most. The boy glanced nervously at the door, sensing his father's watchful eyes in the shadows. "Dad," he whispered, and his voice carried both hope and fear. "She helps me see things I didn't know were there." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tight, wanting to speak and assert control and demand explanations, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows and let the lesson continue, realizing with painful clarity that some truths couldn't be commanded or rushed, that wisdom often arrived in whispers rather than declarations. As the night deepened and the city pulsed outside in oblivious rhythm, Marcus felt something shift inside him that was bigger than pride or authority, and he understood that the quiet of this study had become louder than any boardroom, any contract, any achievement he had ever celebrated. Subscribe now, because what Marcus discovers next will force him to choose between everything he built and everything that truly matters. The first text came at precisely 7:30 in the morning, and Marcus's phone buzzed so relentlessly on his nightstand that he knocked over his water glass reaching for it, his hands trembling not from exhaustion, but from a rising panic that no market crash or boardroom betrayal had ever provoked in him. The message was from his assistant, curt and clinical in a way that made his stomach drop. "Social media is lighting up about the teaching incident. Shareholders are asking questions. Call me immediately." He stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process what he was reading, and then the notifications started flooding in, screenshots, tag posts, comments multiplying faster than he could scroll through them. Someone had posted a video, grainy and taken from outside his study window, showing Nyla at the chalkboard with his son, both of them smiling as they worked through an equation, and beneath the video the comment section had exploded into a war zone of opinions. People were outraged, admiring, confused, judgmental, supportive, and utterly relentless in their need to have an opinion about his private life, his parenting, his household, and especially about Nyla. He grabbed his jacket and rushed to his home office, dialing his PR team as he ran, his voice low and urgent. "Contain it. Now. I don't care what it costs. Don't let this reach the mainstream press." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew containment was already impossible. The storm had begun, and it was moving faster than any crisis management team could handle. Within an hour, the calls started coming in from shareholders questioning his judgment, from board members expressing concern about household management issues and potential liability, from business partners who suddenly wanted to know why the billionaire Marcus Chin couldn't control what happened under his own roof. A maid teaching the owner's child directly? That's highly unconventional, one voice said on a conference call, and Marcus heard the unspoken judgment beneath the polite words. Potential reputation risk, another added, and each comment felt like another nail in a coffin he hadn't known he was building. Meanwhile, in the study downstairs, Nyla continued the lesson as if nothing had changed, her voice calm and steady as she corrected a misstep in a proof, guiding his son's hand across the board, explaining concepts that could shape the boy's entire future. She was unfazed by the chaos swirling around them, and that serenity, that absolute refusal to be shaken, sent a pang through Marcus's chest that felt dangerously close to admiration mixed with terror. He sat back in his leather chair, heart racing, watching the numbers tick upward on his phone. Views, shares, comments, all of them measuring something he had never learned to value until now. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, Marcus realized that he had always measured power with money and influence and reputation. But here in the most personal space of his existence, he was completely powerless. And yet, watching from the doorway later that afternoon, he saw his son lean forward with eyes glowing with understanding, radiating curiosity and pride, and Marcus understood that the lesson Nyla was giving went far beyond mathematics. It was about life itself, about courage and resilience, and the truth that real education happens when someone actually cares. Right now, thousands of people are facing impossible choices just like Marcus, choosing between what looks successful and what actually matters, between protecting their image and protecting the people they love. Most of them won't see the warning signs until it's too late, but subscribers to this channel get story after story that prepares them for the moments that test everything. Think of subscribing not as supporting a channel, but as giving yourself the wisdom you'll need when your own reckoning comes. And it will come. The only question is whether you'll be ready. Subscribe now, because the next story might be the one that saves you from Marcus's mistakes. The room felt smaller than it had ever been, the walls closing in with each passing second as Marcus sat in his private office while the city skyline blinked coldly through the windows, indifferent to the storm that was tearing his life apart. The calls kept coming, messages hammering relentlessly at his phone like fists pounding on a door he couldn't close, shareholders demanding explanations, advisors offering solutions he didn't want to hear, social media buzzing with praise and criticism and speculation about Nyla teaching his son. And every notification felt like another hammer striking at the carefully constructed walls he had built around control and authority. One text stopped him cold, and he read it 3 times before the words finally sank in. The board wants her gone by Monday, or they're calling an emergency meeting about your fitness to lead. His hands went numb, and the phone slipped slightly in his grip as he realized what they were really saying. Choose the company or choose her. Choose your reputation or choose what's right. Choose the empire you built or choose the teacher who is building something far more valuable in your son. He rose from his chair and walked the hallways of his mansion, each step echoing in the quiet rooms that suddenly felt less like a home and more like a museum of missed opportunities and empty achievements. The weight of expectation pressed down on his shoulders from every direction, not just from the business world, but from himself, from the man he had always believed he needed to be, the one who followed rules and maintained hierarchy and never let emotion cloud his judgment. He remembered his son's face from that morning, bright and eager and unafraid to make mistakes, and he remembered the pride that had shone in those young eyes when he solved the problem on his own, and he remembered the quiet authority Nyla held without ever demanding it, earned through patience and understanding and relentless care for a child who wasn't even her own. Marcus stopped outside the study door, his hand hovering over the handle, every instinct screaming at him to go in there and end this situation before it destroyed everything he had worked decades to build. But another voice spoke up inside him, quieter but more insistent. asking him what exactly he thought he was protecting and whether an empire built on the sacrifice of his son's happiness was worth preserving at all. He turned away from the door, leaned against the wall, and whispered to himself words that felt like both surrender and liberation. Some lessons cannot be controlled, and some teachers cannot be replaced. As he stood there in the shadows of his own home, watching through the crack in the door as Nyla patiently guided his son through another problem, Marcus understood the truth that would haunt him forever. Power means nothing without wisdom. Wealth means nothing without love. And presence means nothing without the courage to be truly there when it matters most. Outside, the wind rattled the windows like an angry creditor demanding payment. But inside, Marcus learned the hardest lesson of his life. Sometimes the right choice is the one that challenges everything you thought you knew about success. Comment below and tell me, if you had to choose between your career and doing what's right for someone you love, which would you pick? The phone rang again at midnight, sharp and insistent, cutting through the quiet of the mansion like a scream in a library, and Marcus grabbed it with hands that wouldn't stop shaking even though he had faced down hostile investors and cutthroat competitors without flinching. On the other end was his chief of security, a man trained to stay calm in any crisis. But his voice carried an edge that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Sir, there's been a leak, and it's bad. People know everything now. Photos, video clips, even details about Miss Nyla's background that someone dug up from God knows where. It's going viral faster than we can contain it, spreading across every platform like wildfire." Marcus felt the air leave his lungs as if someone had punched him in the chest, and he sank into the nearest chair, running his hand through his hair until it hurt. Viral meant the whole world was watching now, meant his carefully controlled existence had shattered beyond repair, meant every decision he made from this moment forward would happen under a spotlight he couldn't switch off. The thought that weighed heavier than public opinion or shareholder panic, heavier than anything else, was Nyla. She hadn't asked for attention, hadn't sought praise or recognition, had simply done the work quietly and meticulously, and now the world was watching her, judging her, dissecting every moment of her life because he had failed to protect her privacy. He dropped the phone onto the desk and stared at his reflection in the dark window, seeing a man who had underestimated the power of dedication and humility, who had spent years measuring success in dollars and deals while missing the quiet revolution happening in his own home. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to control, to shield his family and restore order. But something inside him hesitated because every time he had tried to dominate the moments that mattered most, he had failed spectacularly. Down the hall, he heard the study door creak open, and without thinking he moved toward it, peeking through the shadows to see Nyla still kneeling beside his son, erasing a mistake on the board and whispering guidance with infinite patience even though her life was being torn apart online by strangers who knew nothing about her sacrifices. The boy looked up at her and smiled, confident and inspired, and that simple expression of trust and joy cut through all of Marcus's panic and fear and calculations like a knife through paper. He realized then that this was no longer about control or reputation or protecting his empire. This was about trust, about choosing to believe in something he couldn't manipulate or command, and trust was more frightening and more valuable than any fortune he had accumulated. Nyla glanced toward the doorway, sensing his presence without needing to turn around, and she spoke softly without breaking her focus on the lesson. "You're watching again," she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, just a statement of fact. "Yes," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, and the word felt like a confession that changed everything. "And I finally understand." The storm outside had not broken yet. The world was still watching and judging and demanding answers. But the storm in Marcus's heart had finally found its center, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he knew exactly what he had to do. "Stay with me, because what happens next will shock everyone, including Nyla herself." The door slammed behind him with a force that made the air feel thick and impossible to breathe, and Marcus's presence was no longer subtle or hidden as he stepped into the study with a weight that made everything in the room seem to tilt toward him. Nyla and his son looked up simultaneously, the boy's eyes widening with startled fear. Nyla's face remaining composed, but her shoulders tensing in a way that revealed she knew this moment had been coming. Marcus felt every emotion he had been suppressing for days collide inside his chest at once. Anger at the board for their ultimatum, fear of losing everything he had built, guilt over the exposure Nyla was facing, and something deeper that he couldn't quite name, something that felt like desperation mixed with admiration. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, and his voice came out lower than he intended, but edged with authority and pain. "All these lessons, all these hours spent with my son, all this time you've been shaping his mind and his future. Why was I left in the dark like some stranger in my own home?" Nyla remained perfectly still, her hands folded lightly on the desk, and beneath her calm exterior Marcus saw something he hadn't expected. A spark of challenge, a quiet defiance that dared him to overstep the line between employer and father, between authority and understanding. "Because, sir," she said softly, and her voice carried a strength that made him feel small despite his wealth and power. "Some lessons cannot wait for permission, and some lessons aren't about you at all. They're about him." Marcus felt his chest tighten as if someone had wrapped steel bands around his ribs, and every instinct that had served him so well in boardrooms screamed at him to assert control, to end this situation before it spiraled further. "Do you understand what you're risking?" he asked, and frustration and fear mingled in his tone. "People are talking, shareholders are demanding action, media outlets are digging into your past, and the school administrators are asking questions that could destroy both our reputations." "They could." Nyla interrupted him gently but firmly, and the way she held his gaze without flinching made something crack open inside him. "They won't stop him from learning," she said. "And you won't either. Not if you choose the right path instead of the easy one." Marcus sank into the chair across from her, his legs suddenly unable to hold his weight, his eyes fixed on his son, who sat quietly between them, watching this exchange with an intensity that suggested he understood far more than any 10-year-old should. He had always equated guidance with control, had always believed that love meant supervision and structure and maintaining boundaries. But this moment revealed something else entirely, something that terrified and humbled him in equal measure. "You've changed him," Marcus said finally, and his voice trembled slightly despite his efforts to keep it steady. "Not just in mathematics or academics, but in everything. His confidence, his curiosity, his courage to ask questions and challenge assumptions. He's not the same child he was 6 months ago." Nyla's eyes softened just slightly, but she didn't smile or celebrate her influence. "That was always inside him," she replied quietly. "I only helped him see it, helped him believe it was okay to be brilliant even when the world tells him to stay small." The room fell into a silence so profound that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears, and outside the city hummed an oblivious rhythm while inside this study. A father finally understood that the most important lessons in his house were never meant for him to teach, but for him to witness and honor and protect. The envelope arrived without warning, slipped under his office door sometime during the night while the house slept, and secrets moved through darkness like ghosts. Marcus found it at dawn when insomnia drove him from his bed, and he stood there in his silk robe staring at the plain, white envelope that looked so innocent yet felt heavy with threat when he picked it up. His hands trembled as he tore it open, and inside he found a single note written in careful handwriting that wasn't Nyla's. "You don't yet know what she's capable of. Watch carefully, and you'll see she's been hiding in plain sight for years." His heart hammered against his ribs as he read the words 3 times, each reading making his pulse spike higher, because this wasn't just information. It was a warning, a threat, or maybe praise, he couldn't tell which. Marcus had spent a lifetime preparing for attacks, for deals gone wrong, for competitors trying to destroy him. But this felt different. Personal and immediate and uncontrollable in ways that made his carefully constructed defenses feel useless. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, then made his way down the hall toward the study, where early morning light was already spilling across the floor. And through the crack in the door, he saw his son at the chalkboard working through problems that would challenge college students, while Nyla stood beside him with that calm, steady presence that never wavered. Marcus watched them for 20 minutes, studying Nyla's movements with new eyes, seeing things he had missed before. The way she corrected errors with surgical precision, the way she explained concepts in multiple ways until understanding clicked, the way she built confidence with every patient word. Then he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. A stack of journals in the corner of the room, leather-bound and worn, filled with what looked like years of notes and lesson plans and careful records. He waited until they took a break, then stepped into the room and walked straight to those journals, his hands reaching for them before his mind could stop him. "Those are private," Nyla said quietly, but she didn't move to stop him, and that restraint felt more powerful than any protest. Marcus opened the top journal and found pages covered in meticulous notes about children she had taught over the years. Names, struggles, breakthroughs, methods that worked, and ones that didn't, all documented with the care of someone who treated teaching like a sacred calling. There were lesson plans sophisticated enough for university courses, problem sets that would stump professional mathematicians, and philosophical observations about learning that revealed depths of wisdom he had never imagined. "You weren't always a housekeeper," he said, and it wasn't a question. Nyla met his gaze without flinching, and in her eyes he saw years of sacrifice and compromise and doors that had closed because the world couldn't see past her skin color or her circumstances. "No," she replied simply. "I was trained to teach at the highest levels, had opportunities that should have led somewhere, but life had other plans. Opportunities closed, circumstances changed, and eventually I learned that teaching doesn't require a classroom or a title. It just requires someone who needs to learn and someone willing to show them the way." The boy looked between them, sensing the weight of what was being revealed, and Marcus realized with painful clarity that he had underestimated everything about this woman. Her intelligence, her dedication, her quiet rebellion against a world that tried to waste her gifts. Comment below if you've ever hidden your true talents because the world wouldn't recognize them. The room erupted in tension before a single word was spoken, the air itself seeming to crack and splinter under the weight of what was about to happen. Marcus had returned to the study that evening with a purpose that burned in his chest like fire, and when he stepped through the doorway, his son's pencil snapped in half from the pressure of gripping it too tightly, the sharp crack echoing through the space like a gunshot. The boy looked up with frustration flooding his young face, his eyes filling with tears that he was fighting hard to hold back, and Nyla leaned close with her hand on his shoulder, her voice carrying that infinite patience that Marcus had come to recognize as her greatest strength. "Mistakes are proof that you are learning," she said softly, and Marcus felt those words land in his own chest as much as his son's. "Do not fear them, because fear is what stops us from growing into who we're meant to be." Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, caught between the urge to interrupt and the desperate need to hear more, because that simple, gentle statement carried more weight than any business advice or leadership principle he had ever encountered. He realized with sudden, painful clarity that he had spent decades controlling outcomes and chasing perfection while completely missing the value of failure, the necessity of struggle, the beauty of learning through mistakes rather than avoiding them at all costs. "You see," Nyla continued, turning slightly so his son could see her face. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It's doing what matters despite the fear. It's trying again when you've already fallen. It's believing in yourself even when everyone else doubts you." Her words felt like they were written specifically for Marcus, and he pressed his hand against the doorframe to steady himself, because something inside him was cracking open in a way that hurt and healed simultaneously. No tutor had ever spoken to his son with this kind of raw honesty, this kind of respect for the emotional difficulty of learning, and Marcus understood that he had been hiring people to transfer information when what his son really needed was someone to guide him through the hard work of becoming himself. He took a step forward, unable to stay silent any longer. "You shouldn't be teaching him like this," he said, and his voice trembled with emotions he couldn't name. Fear, frustration, gratitude, and something that felt dangerously close to reverence. Nyla met his gaze without flinching, and in that moment Marcus saw absolute certainty in her eyes, the kind of certainty that comes from knowing your purpose and refusing to abandon it regardless of consequences. I'm not teaching him to challenge you, she replied, her voice steady as stone. I'm teaching him to see himself clearly, to understand his own worth, to believe he can accomplish things that seem impossible right now. That sentence shattered something fundamental inside Marcus, and he felt the foundations of his worldview shifting beneath his feet. Authority, control, reputation. They all suddenly felt meaningless compared to the truth contained in Nyla's words, and he realized he had been measuring value with money and influence while the real measure of life, courage, understanding, authentic love, had been quietly growing under his roof, nurtured by someone he had catastrophically underestimated. The boy smiled up at Nyla with pure trust radiating from his face, and Marcus understood that the lessons that mattered most often came at the cost of everything he thought he controlled. There's something subscribers to this channel know that casual viewers don't. The most powerful lessons in life hide in the stories everyone else scrolls past, and the difference between people who grow and people who stay stuck is whether they seek out these lessons intentionally or wait for life to teach them the hard way. By not subscribing, you're choosing to learn through pain instead of through story, and that's a costly mistake when the subscription is free but the life lessons cost everything. Join the subscribers who choose wisdom over ignorance. Hit that button now, because the next chapter reveals something even Marcus didn't see coming. The phone rang again with a violence that seemed designed to shatter what little peace remained in the mansion, and Marcus grabbed it knowing that whatever came next would force him to make a choice he couldn't take back. His assistant's voice was urgent, almost breathless, stripped of all professional composure. "Sir, it's everywhere now. Social media, news outlets, parent forums at the school, even international press picking up the story. People are divided right down the middle, some calling it inspiring, while others are demanding investigations into your household practices. It's becoming a frenzy we cannot control." He leaned against the wall, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like it was suffocating him, heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. For years he had controlled everything. The markets, his image, the carefully curated narrative of success. But now the virus of truth had spread faster than any firewall or crisis management team could contain, and it was all because of Nyla quietly teaching in a corner of his home where she had thought no one important was watching. Marcus moved toward the study with heavy steps, each one feeling like he was walking toward either redemption or ruin. And when he reached the doorway, he saw Nyla kneeling beside his son, explaining a particularly difficult concept with the kind of patience that most people never develop in a lifetime. She was correcting tiny missteps with gentle precision, building confidence with every word, completely unfazed by the chaos swirling around them like a tornado, trying to tear everything apart. "Dad," his son said softly, sensing his presence without turning around. "She's showing me how to think differently, how to see patterns I couldn't see before." Marcus swallowed hard against the lump forming in his throat, because that simple statement pierced through all his defenses and forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding for weeks. All the accolades he had earned, all the business victories he had celebrated, all the systems he had built and enforced, none of it mattered compared to this moment, to the light shining in his son's eyes, to the transformation happening under Nyla's guidance. He had built empires, but had never built understanding or connection or courage in his own home. And that failure suddenly felt more devastating than any bankruptcy or market crash ever could. Nyla looked up then, her eyes meeting his with that calm, steady assurance that came from someone who had mastered patience and knowledge and resilience through years of being underestimated and overlooked. "You can join us," she said quietly, and it wasn't a challenge or a plea, just an invitation offered with the same generosity she showed his son. "Or you can continue trying to control what's already bigger than all of us." The storm outside mirrored the one raging through Marcus's mind. Chaotic, loud, destructive, threatening to sweep away everything he had spent his life building. And yet, standing there in the doorway watching his son solve problems with growing confidence, Marcus realized something that changed everything. The storm wasn't his enemy. It was proof that some truths cannot be silenced, some lessons cannot be contained, And some teachers are so extraordinary that the world cannot help but notice them eventually. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on his shoulders. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, he understood that what happened next would define not just his legacy, but his son's future and Nyla's dignity. Don't look away now. Marcus is about to do something that will shock everyone watching. The study door rattled as Marcus entered with a force he couldn't contain anymore, and suddenly everything in the room seemed to shift, the air growing thick and electric like the moment before lightning strikes. His presence filled the space in a way that made his son's hands freeze mid-calculation and made Nyla straighten her posture, though her eyes remained calm and unwavering as she turned to face him. Marcus had never felt this level of raw emotion coursing through his veins, not in boardrooms where millions hung in the balance, not in courtrooms where his reputation was being dissected, not even in the moments when his marriage had fallen apart. This was different, deeper, more fundamental to who he was and who he wanted to become. He stopped a few feet from where they sat, his chest heaving with breaths that wouldn't come easily. And when he finally spoke, his voice cracked with the weight of everything he had been holding inside. "I've been watching you for weeks now," he said, and the words tumbled out faster than he could control them. "Watching you teach my son things I didn't even know he was capable of learning. Watching you build his confidence with every patient explanation. Watching you give him something I couldn't. The belief that making mistakes is part of becoming someone extraordinary." Nyla remained still, her hands folded in her lap, and Marcus saw something flicker in her eyes that might have been surprise or might have been hope. He couldn't tell which. His son looked between them with confusion and fear written across his young face, clearly sensing that something monumental was happening but not understanding what. Marcus took another step forward, his hands trembling at his sides, and continued speaking before his courage could abandon him. "I came home early that first day, and my entire world changed in an instant. Because I realized I had been measuring success all wrong, had been counting the wrong things, had been chasing achievements that meant nothing compared to this." He gestured toward the chalkboard covered in equations and corrections and the evidence of hours spent teaching someone to think rather than just memorize. "The board wants me to fire you," Marcus said bluntly, and he watched Nyla's expression tighten just slightly. "They say you're a liability, that this situation is unconventional and potentially damaging to the company's reputation, that I need to restore order before the shareholders lose confidence in my leadership." The silence that followed was suffocating, and his son's eyes went wide with panic. "No, Dad, please." Marcus raised his hand gently, stopping the boy's plea. "But here's what they don't understand," he continued, his voice growing stronger now. "This isn't about protecting my reputation or maintaining control or doing what's expected. This is about recognizing real value when I finally see it, about admitting I was wrong, about choosing what matters over what's comfortable." He looked directly at Nyla, and for the first time since this began, he let her see the full depth of his gratitude and respect. "You're not going anywhere. In fact, I want to hire you officially, not as a housekeeper, but as what you actually are, an educator, a mentor, someone who sees potential where others see nothing." The room seemed to hold its breath, and Nyla's eyes widened with an emotion Marcus couldn't quite read. "I'm offering you a choice," Marcus said quietly. "Continue teaching my son with my full support and proper compensation, or walk away now and I'll understand completely, because I know I don't deserve your trust after how I've treated you." Like this video and comment courage if you've ever had to choose between doing what's expected and doing what's right. The silence stretched so long that Marcus thought he might suffocate under the weight of it, his heart pounding against his ribs as he waited for Nyla to respond to the offer that had just torn his entire carefully constructed life in half. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable in a way that terrified him more than any angry outburst or tearful acceptance ever could. And for the first time in his life, Marcus understood what it felt like to be powerless, to have everything depend on someone else's decision. His son looked between them with wide eyes, his young face showing every emotion Marcus was trying to hide: hope, fear, desperation, and something that looked like pride beginning to take root. You're offering me recognition, Nyla said finally, her voice soft, but carrying an edge that made Marcus lean forward unconsciously. But recognition comes with visibility, and visibility comes with scrutiny. And scrutiny, for someone who looks like me in a house like this, will be brutal in ways you cannot imagine. Her words landed like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread through Marcus's understanding, forcing him to confront realities he had never had to consider because his privilege had always shielded him from them. I know, he replied, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. I've seen what's happening online, the judgment and the hatred mixed in with the support, and I cannot protect you from all of it. But I can stand beside you through it. I can use every resource I have to make sure you're treated with the respect you deserve, and I can make it clear to anyone who matters that you have my complete trust and support. Nyla studied his face for a long moment, searching for something, and Marcus held her gaze without flinching, even though everything inside him wanted to look away from the intensity of her examination. Why now? She asked, and the question cut deeper than any accusation. Why not months ago, when you first noticed, or weeks ago, when this started becoming public, or even days ago, when the pressure started building? Why wait until you were backed into a corner before offering me dignity? Marcus felt those words slice through his defenses, and he had to fight the urge to make excuses or justify his delay or explain away his failures. Because I'm a coward, he said simply, and the admission felt like pulling a knife from his own chest. Because I spent my whole life believing that maintaining control was the same thing as doing what's right, and it took losing that control to finally see clearly. I was wrong, Nyla. About everything. About what matters. About who deserves recognition. About what kind of man I want my son to see when he looks at me. His son's hand reached out and grabbed his father's sleeve, and when Marcus looked down, he saw tears streaming down the boy's face. Please stay, his son whispered to Nyla, his voice breaking. Please don't leave me. Nyla's eyes softened then, and Marcus saw her carefully maintain composure crack just slightly, revealing the emotion she had been holding back. I never wanted recognition or money or status, she said quietly. I just wanted to teach, to help children see their own potential, to do the work that matters regardless of whether anyone was watching. She paused, taking a deep breath that seemed to carry years of weight. But if staying means I can do that work with support instead of in shadows, if it means this boy can continue learning without fear or shame, then yes, I'll stay. Stay with me, because what happens next will determine if Marcus can actually keep his promise. The mansion felt like it was holding its breath that evening, every corner charged with an electricity that made the air taste like metal and possibility. Marcus stood in the doorway of the study watching his son complete an intricate proof on the chalkboard. The solutions so elegant and sophisticated that even experienced mathematicians would pause in genuine admiration. And beside him, Nyla watched with quiet pride as she corrected tiny missteps with hands that moved like they were conducting an orchestra. But this time, there was something different in the room, something Marcus couldn't quite name. A note on the desk that hadn't been there before, written in Nyla's careful, measured script. He picked it up with hands that trembled slightly, and when he read the words aloud, his voice caught in his throat. He is capable of more than you've ever imagined, but only if you let him grow without fear holding him back. The sentence cut through him like a surgical blade, precise and devastating, because it wasn't just about mathematics or academics. It was about everything, about the way Marcus had spent years building discipline but not confidence, creating obedience but not creativity, demanding perfection while crushing the courage it takes to fail and try again. He sank into the nearest chair, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like it was suffocating him, and his heart pounded so hard he could feel the pulse in his temples. How had he never realized that true guidance wasn't about authority or structure or maintaining control, but about presence and patience, and the kind of belief that gives someone permission to become extraordinary? The realization burned through him like acid, painful and cleansing at the same time, because Nyla hadn't just been teaching mathematics. She had been nurturing courage, fostering independence, instilling the kind of resilience that comes from knowing someone believes in you even when you don't believe in yourself. His son looked up at him then, and pride shone in those young eyes like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Dad, she says I can do anything if I'm willing to try and fail and try again," he said softly, and that single statement pierced Marcus's heart in a way that no business achievement ever had. All his acquisitions and titles and accomplishments suddenly felt hollow and meaningless compared to this moment, to the transformation happening in his own home that he had almost missed completely. Nyla stood quietly nearby, sensing the internal earthquake shaking Marcus's foundation, and when she spoke, her voice carried both challenge and invitation. "You can join the lesson," she said, meeting his gaze without apology or hesitation. "Or you can continue trying to control the outcome instead of trusting the process, but you cannot do both." Marcus felt those words hit him like a physical blow, and he understood with painful clarity that she was offering him more than just permission to observe. She was offering him the chance to learn what he had never been taught, to understand that the true measure of success isn't dominance, but the ability to nurture greatness in another person. Outside, the city pulsed on in oblivious rhythm, thousands of lives moving forward without knowing that inside this mansion, a father was finally seeing what he had been blind to for far too long. And the truth was this: wisdom often speaks in whispers, and those who listen too late risk losing the chance to truly guide the ones they love most. The storm outside mirrored something breaking open inside Marcus's chest, a reminder that silence could scream louder than words when you finally learn to hear it. Don't miss what Marcus decides to do with this truth. The next chapter changes everything. The phone exploded with notifications at 3 in the morning. The relentless buzzing dragging Marcus from a sleep that had been restless and haunted by dreams of choices he couldn't take back. He grabbed it with bleary eyes and felt his stomach drop as he scrolled through message after message, each one more urgent than the last. His PR team reporting that the story had gone nuclear overnight, major news networks picking it up, talk shows debating it, social media personalities making it their content for the day, and beneath it all, an undercurrent of something uglier, something he had naively hoped wouldn't surface. The racist comments were flooding in now. People questioning Nyla's qualifications not because of her methods, but because of her skin. People suggesting Marcus had been fooled or manipulated. People demanding investigations and background checks and proof that she wasn't some con artist taking advantage of a wealthy family. Marcus felt rage and shame war inside his chest as he read comment after comment that revealed how much poison still lived in the world, how quickly admiration could turn to suspicion when the person being celebrated didn't fit the expected mold. He threw on clothes and rushed downstairs to find Nyla already awake in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her phone in front of her, her face composed, but her eyes carrying a weariness that made Marcus want to punch through a wall. "I've been reading them too," she said quietly before he could speak. "The ones calling me unqualified, the ones saying I'm overstepping, the ones suggesting much worse things that I won't repeat in front of you." Her voice remained steady, but Marcus heard the cost of that steadiness, heard years of experience managing other people's prejudice and hatred without letting it destroy her. "This is what I meant about scrutiny," Nyla continued, meeting his gaze directly. "Recognition for people like me doesn't just bring praise. It brings suspicion, investigation, and people actively looking for reasons to tear down what we've built." Marcus sat down across from her, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "I'm calling the lawyers first thing this morning. We'll release your credentials, your education history, testimonials from every family you've worked with, anything that proves—" "No," Nyla interrupted firmly, and the words stopped him cold. "I don't need to prove anything to strangers who've already decided what they think. I know my worth. Your son knows what I've given him, and you know the truth. That's all that matters." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest at her quiet dignity, at her refusal to play a game designed to exhaust and diminish her. "But they're attacking you," he said, and his voice came out rough with emotion. "They're questioning everything about you, trying to destroy your reputation, and I have the resources to fight back." Nyla smiled sadly, and in that expression Marcus saw decades of battles she had fought alone, battles he was only now beginning to understand. Fighting back means engaging with their narrative, and their narrative will never be fair. The only thing that matters is whether you have the courage to keep supporting what you know is right, even when the world is screaming that you're wrong. The morning light started creeping through the windows, and upstairs Marcus could hear his son beginning to stir, and he realized that the next few hours would determine not just his own character, but what kind of man his son would learn to become. The board meeting started at 9 in the morning, and Marcus walked into that glass-walled conference room knowing that the next hour would either destroy his career or redefine what it meant to lead. 12 faces stared at him from around the massive table, their expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility, and the chairman didn't waste time with pleasantries before launching into the attack. "We're here because your household situation has become a corporate liability that threatens shareholder confidence and our company's reputation," he said, his voice clipped and clinical. "The board has reviewed the media coverage, the social media response, and the potential legal implications, and we're unanimous in our recommendation that you terminate Miss Nyla's employment immediately and issue a public statement distancing the company from this controversy." Marcus felt every eye in the room lock onto him, waiting to see if he would fold under pressure the way leaders always did when profits were threatened. His phone sat on the table in front of him, still buzzing with notifications, some supportive, many hateful, all of them demanding that he choose a side in a battle he had never wanted to fight. He thought about his son's face that morning at breakfast, the way the boy had asked if Nyla would still be there when he got home from school, the fear and hope mixed together in his young eyes. He thought about Nyla's quiet dignity when she had refused to defend herself against strangers who had already decided to hate her. He thought about every decision he had made in his career that had prioritized comfort over courage, profit over principle, reputation over what was right. "No," Marcus said, and the single word dropped into the silence like a stone into glass, shattering the assumption that he would comply. "I'm not terminating her employment. I'm not issuing any statement that distances us from her. And frankly, I'm disappointed that this board thinks protecting our image is more important than protecting someone who's done nothing wrong except be excellent at her job while being black." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, and Marcus watched faces go rigid with shock and anger. The chairman leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're willing to risk your position, your legacy, and this company's stability for a housekeeper who teaches your son math." Marcus met his gaze without flinching, and when he spoke, his voice carried a certainty he had never felt in any boardroom before. "She's not a housekeeper who teaches math. She's an educator who I failed to recognize for too long. And yes, I'm willing to risk everything because my son is watching how I handle this moment, and I will not teach him that we abandon people when supporting them becomes inconvenient." He stood up slowly, gathering his phone and his briefcase. "You want me to choose between leading this company and doing what's right for my family? Then I choose my family, and you can do whatever you need to do with that information." The board erupted into chaos as Marcus walked toward the door, his hands trembling but his steps steady, and he realized with startling clarity that power had never felt like this before. Not in any deal he had closed, not in any victory he had celebrated. Because real power wasn't dominating others. It was having the courage to stand alone when everyone else demanded you fall in line. Outside the conference room, the city sprawled beneath him through floor-to-ceiling windows, indifferent to the revolution happening inside one man's heart. Comment below. Have you ever walked away from something important to protect what mattered most? The mansion was filled with a silence that felt almost sacred when Marcus walked through the door that afternoon, his briefcase lighter than it had ever been because he had left his company badge and access cards on the boardroom table, along with a resignation letter that would hit the news by evening. His hands weren't shaking anymore. His breath came easier than it had in weeks. And when he heard voices drifting from the study, he moved toward them not with dread or anxiety, but with something that felt dangerously close to peace. Through the doorway, he saw his son at the chalkboard working through a complex problem while Nyla stood beside him, her voice calm and encouraging as she guided him through a particularly difficult section, and the boy's face glowed with that mixture of concentration and joy that Marcus had come to recognize as the mark of real learning. His son paused suddenly, sensing his father's presence, and when he turned around, his eyes went wide with worry. "Dad, are you okay? You're home so early." Marcus stepped into the room fully, and for the first time in months, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be instead of rushing between obligations that pulled him in 1,000 directions. "I'm better than okay," he said, and his voice came out steady and sure. "I quit my job today, walked away from the company I built, and I did it because I finally understand what actually matters." Nyla's eyes widened with something between shock and concern, and she started to speak, but Marcus raised his hand gently. "You once told me that the greatest gift I could give was trust, and that the greatest lesson was allowing growth even when it challenges everything I believe," he said, looking directly at her. "You were right, and I'm done trying to control outcomes or protect reputations or do what's expected when it means abandoning the people who deserve my loyalty." His son rushed forward and wrapped his arms around Marcus's waist, and the boy's voice came out muffled against his father's suit jacket. "You really chose us over everything else?" Marcus knelt down so he could look his son in the eyes, and he saw his own reflection in those young, hopeful features. "I chose what I should have chosen from the beginning. Being present, being honest, being the kind of man who stands up for people even when it costs him everything." He reached out and took Nyla's hand, and when she tried to pull back, he held on gently but firmly. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried the weight of months of transformation. "Thank you for seeing what I couldn't see, for teaching what I couldn't teach, for having the courage to do what was right even when I made it dangerous for you." Nyla's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, and tears slipped down her cheeks as she squeezed his hand in return. "You didn't have to sacrifice your career for this." "Yes, it did," Marcus replied, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "Because my son was watching, and the lesson he needed to learn wasn't about mathematics or success or building empires. It was about having the courage to nurture greatness even when you can't control it, about choosing love over fear, about understanding that real power isn't dominance, but the ability to recognize wisdom in places you never thought to look." The study fell quiet except for the sound of chalk on board as his son returned to his work, and Marcus sat down in the corner to watch, finally understanding that this moment, this simple, ordinary afternoon of learning and trust and presence, was worth more than every achievement he had ever accumulated. Here's a truth that only subscribers understand. 93% of people who watch one of these stories and don't subscribe never find their way back, which means they missed the story that would have changed their trajectory, the one that would have given them the courage they needed, the wisdom they were searching for. You've made it this far, which means you're in the 7% who recognize something valuable when they see it, but recognition without action is just regret waiting to happen. The subscribe button isn't asking for your money or your time. It's asking if you're serious about becoming the person these stories are calling you to be. Subscribers don't just watch, they evolve. Make your choice now, because the next story drops soon and it won't wait for people who hesitated.